half of whose board is appointed by the president, is the most secret aspect in all of government. Think about it. The job of the CIA is to steal and to keep secrets. But we know more about the CIA than we do the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is a private, completely unregulated bank. Talking to me now to discuss all of this, Nick Gillespie, editor-in-chief of ReasonTV.com. You were here when I spoke with Congressman Ron Paul, right, who is enthusiastic and optimistic that the Audit the Fed bill may finally become law, even though a lot of garbage and nonsense may become law with it, even though some things that those of us who believe in the Constitution and the primacy of the individual and the free market may find offensive and assaulting. If this bill becomes law and the Fed truly is audited and the courts don't interfere with it and an audit takes place, you got all those ifs? What, Nicholas Gillespie, might we hope to find?
I suspect that it's more likely that the bike paths or whatever else are wrapped up in the Audit the Fed bill will be passed in a way and implemented long before the actual audit of the Fed comes. I do think what is important, regardless of what actually happens, is that new attention is being paid to the Fed's role, in the past 10, 15 years worth of economic issues. I mean, the Fed is definitely at the center of a lot of our economic problems, a lot of our woes. Bernanke's reappointment hearings, I think, will function not quite as good as an Audit the Fed, but that should provide a backdrop for a conversation that is long overdue.
But if Congressman Paul is right, and that is the core of Audit the Fed has not been watered down and is not watered down, will the Congress actually be able to send in accountants who will say, oh, in 1923 you loaned this to the King of England, and in 1927 he paid you back that, and who got the profit? I mean, are we finally going to learn what happened between 1913 and 2009 that caused the American dollar to be devalued by 92%?
The short answer is I don't think so, because I don't think that there is any way that this will go through in a way where we would have a full open book audit, because it is simply too central to the way that modern government functions, to the extent, I mean, we've talked about this in the past, to the extent that the Commerce Clause is completely elastic and the government stretches it to cover every possible activity. The Fed is even more basic in a sense, by controlling the money supply in the United States and, by extension, many parts of the world. There's no way they're opening that up to sunlight.
Last week, I was filling in for Glenn Beck on his program, I think on Thursday, and I decided to explain fiat money. And what caused me to explain it, to want to explain it, was that morning AIG, the insurance company that received $85 billion from the Fed, so that it could pay its creditors, many of whose former officers worked in the government, like Goldman Sachs, another story for another time, decided it wanted to pay back some of the $85 billion. And it wanted to pay it back by giving the Fed shares of stock in a corporation that AIG, owned, and it told the Fed it could sell those shares. So I wanted to demonstrate how funny money went out of the Fed, the $85 billion, but real money came in. So the Fed made a tremendous profit on this loan. When I got up and explained on air that the Fed literally creates money, not by running a printing press, but by adding zeros to a bank's column on the bank's ledger sheet, the emails were overwhelming, and they basically said, we believed this, we thought this, we heard this, but this is the first time we've seen it demonstrated. Question, why is it so surprising for the American public to learn that the Fed has essentially been a fraud?
Well, I would not go so far as to say that the Fed is always and everywhere a fraud, but I do think that, the federal money supplier, the Fed, is kind of like the water that we as fishes swim in, and you really don't think about it until it becomes so polluted or so clogged up or so muddy that finally you realize that whatever you're swimming in is really a lot of muck.
Joining us now is Peter Schiff, the president of Euro-Pacific Capital and a candidate for the Republican nomination for the United States Senate in the Nutmeg State in Connecticut, who was a little delayed because of the elements, as lawyers say, an act of God. But Peter, welcome here. Welcome back to Freedom Watch. In your absence, we chatted with Congressman Ron Paul, who's extremely optimistic that his Audit the Fed bill will become law, even though a lot of other horrendous assaults on the free market, on Economics 101, on the Constitution, and on natural rights will become law as well. But Nick Gillespie and I were talking that even though this will be a real audit, Nick is of the view that the Fed will still find a way to keep us from learning the truth. Question to you, Peter Schiff. If the law of the land is that a real audit happens and auditors and accountants hired by the Congress go over to the Fed to look at their books, do you expect they will learn the truth?
Well, do I expect that we're going to get an honest audit out of the federal government? I mean, I think that nothing that's coming out of the federal government is honest. The numbers that they give us on inflation, on GDP, on productivity, it's all a lie. So why should I expect any more forthrightness when it comes to auditing the Fed? But at least we're going to have the pretense of auditing the Fed, it looks like.
Just as you arrived, we were talking about fiat money, something that you have educated me on, as well as a lot of people who think the way we do about the value of the dollar. And I was telling Nick Gillespie, when I explained this last week on the air, I received hundreds and hundreds of emails from people who were incredulous to learn that the Fed doesn't actually run printing presses, but effectively runs printing presses by adding zeros in its depositors' columns in the Fed's bank account. Why don't people understand that? And why don't they realize that the very act of doing that causes the cruelest tax of all, which is inflation?
Well, because the government has been very successful with this disinformation campaign to confuse the public as to what inflation means. You know, I used to say they're going to print money until they run out of ink, but now they're not limited by the supply of ink. They don't need any. They just do it electronically. And, you know, when I talk about going back to a gold standard or having, real money, people, my political, opponents would say, oh, Peter Schiff wants to go backwards. He wants to go back to the 1970s. They want to go back to the 1770s with their fiat money. They want to repeat the Continental. I think that the founding fathers were going forward to a gold standard because they understood the evils of paper money, and we're experiencing those evils right now. And unfortunately, we're going to experience them much worse in the years ahead.
We're chatting with Peter Schiff, who's the president of Euro Pacific Capital, and Nick Gillespie, who's the editor-in-chief of Reason TV and Reason.com. Before Peter came on, we were talking about the educational benefit of an aggressive grilling of Ben Bernanke. And are you surprised that the most aggressive grillings of him came from the most conservative Republican senator on that committee, who's Jim Bunning, the Hall of Fame pitcher, who called Ben Bernanke a moral hazard and said, we should dispatch you back to Princeton, and a socialist on the floor of the United States Senate, Bernie Sanders in Vermont? Is the antipathy towards the Fed stretching, Nick Gillespie, from one end of the political spectrum to the other?
I think that it has always been there. I mean, the suspicion of central banks or of politically manipulative banks has always come from a kind of free market on the right, as well as a socialist understanding of things on the left. They understand public choice economics. It's not a surprise that libertarian economists and socialist economists are the ones who basically develop public choice, the idea that the government works in its own interest while telling a story about helping everybody else out. I do think one of the things to pick up on what Peter was talking about, I don't think that we have an ability to use gold or anything else to restrain government spending at this point. I do think that one thing that is very useful is public outrage is the way which we'll do this. The economic crisis, Ben Bernanke's comments, the way that the government is acting and the way that it is spending, that is what's going to ultimately reel in government spending. When people educate themselves and get fed up and go to the barricades.
Peter, I don't want to debate history, Peter, but it was a Democrat, FDR, who, by the way, just as an authoritarian, declared that gold could no longer be owned or possessed or used as a means of currency, and then the Congress enacted a law to support him. And then 40 years later, a Republican, Richard Nixon, finished off what was then left of the gold standard.
Sure, but even though Roosevelt made it illegal to own gold, the dollar was still defined as a weight of gold, and so we were still on a gold standard, albeit not as good a gold standard. There was some restraint on government spending, and at least back then there was some respect for the Constitution. Now there's none. No respect for the Constitution whatsoever, and nothing to restrain government spending. I don't think outrage is going to do it. I mean, we've been outraged about the spending a long time, and it hasn't stopped it. We need real discipline in Washington, not just the public getting upset.
Well, what will it take for the public to realize that when we were on the gold standard and didn't have a central bank, put aside the 20 years of the First National Bank and the Second National Bank, those creations of Alexander Hamilton's that Andrew Jackson killed off.
Right.
The value of the dollar in those years, I'm rounding off the numbers, 1776 to 1913, when the current Fed is founded, up 13%. 1913 to 2009, down 92%. Now, it doesn't take an economist from Princeton to understand that, does it?
And what people also don't understand is the Industrial Revolution was the most prosperous period of U.S. history, the most economic growth, no question about it. It exceeded anything of the 20th century, and we were under a gold standard the entire time.
Nick.
Here, it is over for the gold standard. I mean, it is a useful way of talking about things, but we're not going back to a
You are
gold standard.
predicting
Any kind of metallic standard.
You are not saying